Hi, my name is Maurice McDermott, and I'm President and CEO of the Whitty Museum. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a dear friend, somebody I've known for decades, Dr. Gerald E. Poyo. He has been my mentor for all these many years with his wisdom and his perspective that is so unusual and so schooled in scholarship and detail. The very first book that I read that Jerry and Gilberto Hinojosa wrote together was called Tejano Origins, the 18th Century San Antonio. And if you can imagine someone who knows that 18th century Spanish, understands what happened here at the building blocks of this great city, it was an inspiring book to read. And by the way, it's not all triumphant prose. There are a lot of challenges, a lot of bravery and resilience in that book, as he provided evidence of the origins of the Tejano San Antonio. And with that, it was so clear that we wanted Dr. Poyo to weigh in on this idea of resilience, the fabric of our experience. And though he is so modest, when you listen to him, he's so modest about his qualifications to speak on this, I cannot imagine a more important scholar to weigh in on the idea of resilience in the state of Texas and on the Tejano spirit in particular. And with that, let me read the biography of Dr. Poyo. Gerald E. Poyo is O'Connor Professor in the History of Hispanic Texas and the Southwest at St. Mary's University here in San Antonio, Texas. In 1983, he received his PhD in Latin American history from the University of Florida. His research has focused on the intersection of Latin America and U.S. Latino history, especially in the history of Cuban exile communities in the United States during the 19th and 20th century. Also on the origins of the Tejano communities in colonial and Mexican Texas, and Latino history narratives. He is the author and editor of 8 books and numerous academic articles. His most recent book is A Latino Memoir, Identity, Family, and the Common Good. Dr. Poyo suggested to me that there are traumas and memories in people that last generations. And that is a provocative idea. And it's one that he will address today. And I look forward to sharing our time together, listening to Dr. Poyo.
Good afternoon. Happy to be here at the Whitty conference on Texas history. And I want to thank the Whitty for this invitation, and especially Maurice McDermott, who not only asked me, but then suggested a topic, which at first I thought I wasn't sure what I was going to do with. But once I started thinking about it, it seemed to me that my background in Latino history offers one perspective, one way to think about this topic. So that's what I am doing with my presentation today. So the topic is bravery and resilience, the fabric of our historical experience. Bravery is the quality that allows people to confront situations that are dangerous or frightening, and resilience is the human ability to carry on in positive ways despite traumatic misfortune or abuse. Both speak to the personal and emotional reservoirs needed to discern, make decisions, and move on during challenging times. Through this bravery and resilience, people persist, create, and weave the fabric of their national experiences. I recently engaged stories of bravery and resilience writing a memoir on family history, identity, and the complexities of understanding the common good. Using archival research, oral histories, and my own acts of remembering, I uncovered details of my family's trajectory over 5 generations, which gave me an appreciation of what motivated them, their challenges, their courage, and their ability to move forward. Their stories helped me understand at a very intimate level what it means to be human during times of difficulty and even danger, and have helped inform some of my thoughts in this essay, which reflects my interest in objective historical inquiry and a desire to speak subjectively and forthrightly about some of history's controversial topics. As I began, my first thought was that we all have to be brave to engage the world in all its complexity. Life is full of everyday challenges, but also considerable brutality and injustice. Confronting life's challenges requires unexceptional, ordinary behavior, but sometimes it must be extraordinary too. In either case, bravery inspires us to avoid paralysis. We also have to be resilient to take the next steps. Unless we just give up, and many facing serious challenges do, we have little choice but to be resilient. Historically, probably few people have thought of themselves as either courageous or resilient, but rather have spent most of their time just figuring out how to survive and thrive. The reality, of course, is that bravery and resilience are just words and mean little unless considered within the intimate realities of everyday human experiences. Without understanding people's specific difficulties and contexts and learning their responses, we cannot know much about the meaning of human actions. As a historian of Latinos, I've learned much about the bravery and resilience of non-white people, which has been present throughout the course of United States history. No one has a monopoly on bravery and resilience, but some people's struggles are more consistently recognized than others. Society has resisted incorporating the intimate historical struggles of Native Americans, African Americans, Mexican Americans, and others into the nation's overall consciousness, with consequences for those ignored and the country's overall self-understanding as well. As resurgent social movements on the streets demand racial and social justice, it seems like an appropriate moment to think about the bravery and resilience that it takes to express long-standing grievances. Right now, the grievances are about the killing of young African Americans today, but also about so much more. Our national reluctance to acknowledge hard, dark historical truths have prevented a balanced evaluation of our nation's overall experience, and not surprisingly, has left many people sincerely shocked and puzzled about the dramatic events they are witnessing on the evening news. Although American history includes many admirable qualities and achievements, it also possesses an astounding lack of humility that has obscured the need for citizens to acknowledge the darker aspects of its past. I have always thought of the United States as a braggadocio nation, frequently having to reassure itself of its greatness and constantly trying to convince the world of American goodness and uniqueness. But some of our citizens have always known of the darker side. For years, African Americans and other groups in the United States have bravely placed their lives on the line to challenge injustice and have been resilient in the face of consequences if they survived. Difficult experiences of the nation's less privileged and historically oppressed citizens offer especially dramatic stories of bravery and resilience, although mostly not recognized in popular consciousness. Ironically, the horrors and consequences of the Holocaust are well known in the United States, other people's crimes in foreign places that had to be remembered, and rightly so. This remembering revealed much about people's responses in the midst of tragedy. I cannot help wondering why in the United States we are willing to contemplate the horrors of committed to Jews, nonconformists, and others in Europe during World War II, but are mostly reluctant to publicly embrace our nation's assaults on Native Americans, Africans, Mexicans, and others. One exception, perhaps, has been the story of the Japanese internment camps during World War II that challenged Japanese Americans to be brave and redefine their futures in the face of life-altering losses. Coming to age in the 1960s, I rarely heard the details of 4 centuries of warfare and atrocities across the Western Hemisphere against Native Americans, which continues in different forms today. American movies and television shows in the 1950s and 1960s gave me a distorted understanding of the conquest of the West, benignly known as Manifest Destiny and the Westward Movement. During my time studying at university, a deeper dive into the nation's history revealed things of which I had known little or nothing. I had never learned of the Mexican War or the fate of Mexico's northernmost peoples after annexation to the United States. As a graduate student, I read Leonard Pitt's classic, The Decline of the Californios, and I still remember how flabbergasted I felt about the way American newcomers systematically dismantled California society. Later, I read Arnoldo de Leon's They Called Them Greasers, which left me equally indignant about the treatment of Mexicans in Texas. I knew about African American slavery, of course, but little about about what the slaves actually endured. In time, my anger grew and undermined my idealism about humanity's capacity for good over evil. I had a hard time accepting the way societies told their histories, emphasizing heroism, boosterism, and celebration, avoiding or making excuses for the injustices in their historical records. Later, as my study of history broadened in concentric circles, a sense of helplessness and anxiety about the brokenness of our human species replaced the anger. In moments of cynicism, I concluded that human atrocities are inevitable and that remembering does not help. These feelings were even worse than the anger. How, I wondered, can we cope with such darkness, which does not seem to lighten as the human story proceeds? These hard lessons and questions about the human condition remain constant, but I learned that it is precisely in remembering and documenting that difficult history that we may inquire and understand from where people draw the courage to endure. It is in this persistence that we learn about the fabric of the human experience in times of difficulty and danger, the drive to survive, protect family, help each other, and build community. It is what allows us to start again, continue, or embrace whatever action is required, and provide confidence that human beings may learn from the past and develop a capacity to work for the common good. Historians began to reveal these dark secrets of United States history in earnest as the field professionalized and diversified, especially after the 1950s. And since then, much more research and writing has broadened our understanding of these difficult aspects of our past. Nevertheless, most Americans still know little of this history. So-called revisionist perspectives could not dent conventional perceptions that have remained ensconced in public history venues and in the popular mind. For at least 2 generations, numerous historians and authors have chiseled away at the great fortress that is the myth of the Alamo, advancing lots of reasons to question traditional perspectives, but without much affecting the way most people in Texas and beyond interpret the story. People do not usually want to hear about their own history's unsavory dimensions, a denial unsurprisingly embedded in current discourses about making America great again and the long-standing notions of American exceptionalism more generally. The obvious questions are, when exactly was America great, and for whom was it great? Was it during the 1980s, when the government began a wholesale dismantling of support for the poor, during George Wallace's opposition to integration in the 1960s, during the KKK resurgence in the 1920s, when racists routinely lynched African Americans, Mexicans, and others, during the Civil War, during Andrew Jackson's assaults on Native Americans, during the antebellum times when slavery thrived despite the principles included in the Declaration of Independence. For many people, these were not great times. Imagine a national museum in Washington, D.C. that tells of the collective injustices committed against peoples in the Americas, perhaps next to the Holocaust Museum that so well and importantly documents European atrocities against Jews and others. We are learning more and more about the difficult aspects of American experience, but why has it been so hard to integrate them into popular consciousness? The point is not to promote a wholesale condemnation of American history, but to encourage people to be as conscious of darkness as the light if we really want to learn something about bravery, resilience, and the fabric of our experience and the human condition more generally. To be open to a balanced understanding with room for proud, inspiring moments, as well as times of injustices and oppression, which after all is inherent in the human story. Without a deep recognition of the challenges people have faced in order to survive, persist, and thrive, ascribing bravery and resilience can never be more than a self-deluded exercise in grandiosity. We should also ask, whose bravery, whose resilience, and under what circumstances? Interpreters of the past routinely assign attributes of courage and resilience to those they believe deserving, and in that way make judgments about who society should hold up for admiration or celebration. As a youth, I took at face value celebratory history books that ascribe success and recognition to people in military, political, or business careers, also to ordinary people who achieved the success and recognition they thought all could aspire to if they just worked hard enough. Describing bravery and resilience is kind of like deciding upon our heroes, a virtue we so desperately seek in our society and of which we have such a difficult time letting go. Witness the current battles over historical statues that raise the question of who gets to decide which historical events and actions epitomize bravery and resilience, and why. What are the criteria? Despite their treachery, many prefer to honor slave owners and Confederate generals and politicians as symbols of a noble and heroic heritage without even a nod to the contributions of slaves to Southern history. Very recently, a member of the US Senate defended slavery as, quote, a necessary evil required to build this country, as if there had been no options, without even a word about the overall contributions of the slaves. Likewise, the popular mind still assigns bravery and resilience to poverty-stricken European immigrants who built our cities and heroic American settlers moving west as they fended off the, quote, savage Indians who refused to see the superiority and benefits of Western life. Or to the defenders of the Alamo, but not to the Mexican community that persisted in the face of the subordination imposed by those who took control of San Antonio. Bravery and resilience are not always dramatic. In my current research project, I explore the barriers Mexican children faced obtaining an education in San Antonio during the second half of the 19th century. When the Society of Mary established St. Mary's Institute in 1852, the Marianists welcomed Mexican children, who in fact constituted the largest ethnic group at the school for many years, larger in number than Anglo, German, and French children. Nevertheless, Mexican kids encountered difficulties. Mostly economically and socially marginalized in Barrio Laredito, west of San Pedro Creek, the segregation deepened already rooted racism, which influenced the way children interacted with each other. Writing in the early 1880s, journalist Alexander E. Sweet, son of James R. Sweet, a know-nothing politician who served briefly as mayor of San Antonio, remembered that as a child he, quote, met the Mexican foe in deadly conflict between the Mexican boys on the west bank of San Pedro Creek and the American boys on the east side. There was war all the time, close quote. Imagine the Mexican children having to walk to school from Laredito, across town through non-Mexican neighborhoods to College Street on the other side of the San Antonio River to attend St. Mary's Institute. Nevertheless, the Mexican children attended. But as a century proceeded into the Jim Crow era and racism and segregation deepened, the Marianists eventually conformed to segregated realities. The Marianists explained, quote, many people did not favor the idea of sending their children to St. Mary's College as long as the poor Mexican class was taught there. There was then at the college an extra class for the poor Mexican boys who had to learn English, another primary grade for the American boys. From these two classes, promotions were made to the higher grades of the college. Thus, the whole college soon had a strong tincture of the Mexican element. Anglo-American opposition to this Mexican tincture threatened the school's financial stability, and finally, San Antonio's Archbishop and the Marianists established a separate school called San Fernando for the poor Mexican children in their own neighborhood on North Laredo Street. Mexican families always adapted, sending their children to school wherever and whenever possible, first to St. Mary's Institute across town, and then to their neighborhood school, San Fernando, which despite being less equipped, staffed, and funded than St. Mary's, the children attended with enthusiasm and learned from the Marianists. Later, they also attended other West Side schools as they emerged. This story is a good example of quiet bravery and resilience in action. As we learn more about the hardships people faced, we may be better prepared to understand the legacies they endured. As Monica Munoz Martinez reminds us in her recent book, The Injustice Stays With Them, Anti-Mexican Violence in Texas, the descendants of those who faced atrocities at the hands of the Texas Rangers for years silently carried the traumas of what happened to family and friends. Besides documenting the crimes, she writes about the legacy. The descendants of those who suffer mistreatment, and oppression do not generally forget, even if everyone else does. Details may fade, but the embedded discomfort and repressed anger does not, especially if the remnants of that oppression recur in different ways to subsequent generations. Muñoz Martinez documented the history of aggrieved descendants who narrated their stories of resilience when finally asked. Perhaps that is what Black Lives Matter movement is all about as well, and accounts for the deeply embedded anger demonstrators have expressed over and over. Many scholars have worked for years to uncover and disseminate this difficult history, but mostly without the cooperation of education boards, state and national leaders, well-placed and influential opinion makers, and public intellectuals. They are critically needed voices to achieve a much-needed shift in public consciousness about these matters, but often they do more damage than good. Few American leaders have ever avoided the popular demand to engage in this rhetoric of exceptionalism, and the current president is no exception. When the president of the United States recently traveled to Tulsa, Oklahoma for a rally the day after highly publicized Juneteenth celebrations, he condemned anti-racism demonstrations and defended Confederate statues. In effect, he pushed back on the many efforts to seek a balanced understanding of our national experience by, in effect, reaffirming long ago discredited arguments about a historically benign Southern slave system. The president might have offered instead a healing gesture, acknowledging and lamenting the racist legacies that prompted white rioters to burn down Tulsa's African-American neighborhoods in 1921, leaving at least 300 dead. He could have celebrated, despite the still open wounds, the community's bravery and persistence in building their fortunes. Even if we cannot always depend on our leaders and influencers of public opinion to set the proper direction and tone, there are ways of challenging popular perceptions if we summon valor and persistence. As I suggested earlier, public history venues, especially museums like the Whitty, national parks, local historical societies, and heritage centers are equipped to do this work. And many have done just that, but they must be willing to risk the wrath of those who refuse to open their minds and engage difficult issues. The Bullock Museum in Austin, for example, stepped up and produced an exhibition and conference based on Muñoz Martinez's research. Life and Death on the Border in 1910 to 1920 opened in January 2016 and had an important impact. But unfortunately, as a temporary exhibit, it closed after only 4 months. How much of the awareness generated by the exhibit will survive in future generations? Perhaps another public history approach with even more potential for engaging popular audiences are digital platforms hosted by universities, museums, local history societies, and other institutions that reach much beyond their local constituencies and have greater opportunity for remaining accessible for many years. Making the information available in many forms is just a first step. It also takes the willingness of people to probe deeply into themselves and recognize that we all have an equal claim to this land. Understanding many of the country's current social problems requires learning about our past wrongs. Focusing on the difficult legacies of these wrongs that remain with us today may inspire a resolve to find creative solutions to the continuing economic and social inequities that are a direct result. Accepting and challenging narratives has been hard for the United States, as with most countries for that matter. But any nation that considers itself exceptional should not refuse to admit to unexceptional motives and actions in its history. And remembering, we may bring everyone's experiences of bravery and resilience to full consciousness and begin to see the entire fabric of our national history. The humility this engenders may contribute to needed adjustments to the nation's self-image and offer new paths to achieving a common good. Thank you so much.